Today we're going to have a bit of a chat about which of the armies in 40k are the strongest and the weakest. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our armies on the tabletop. Now, I don't often tend to do ranking type videos where we're saying one army or faction is better than another, or whether one unit is absolutely superior to another one, unless it objectively supersedes it in every way. In particular, I think the discussion of strongest army is a bit of a contentious one, as I do honestly think it means different things to different people. The general overall power of a faction in terms of how strong each unit choice is a bit of a different question to which of the armies are winning the tournaments at the moment, because quite often tournament winning armies just exploit one incredibly strong unit or one incredibly strong mechanic within an army, or can get to very strong levels if you manage to line up multiple complex moving units. But it might be a very complicated army to use, such as Genestealer Cult or something with a lot of psychic powers, like Thousand Sons. The relative strength of armies also depends on what sort of missions you're playing. For example, tough, durable armies with a lot of bodies might do better at objective scoring missions, where murderous, bloodthirsty armies with a ton of guns might do better at missions where there's a lot of killing. Finally, also the meta might determine how good an army is. For example, if everyone was playing horde armies, then an army that was very good at dealing with hordes would be far stronger just because it's dealing with its ideal matchup a lot of the time. All that being said, in this video I have tried to rank the factions in a rough weakest to strongest list, largely being based on how they are played at a bit more of a casual level rather than absolute top tier tournament builds, which sees a lot of the slightly weaker factions becoming very, very strong if you take one certain combo of units and play them well. Now, with any sort of list like this, everyone has their own personal opinion based on their own experiences, heavily depending on what armies that they've come across and which armies they play themselves, and whether you're more interested in playing optimised tournament games or games where you're using a bit more of a variety of the faction's units. I'm absolutely not saying that this is a definitive 100% set in stone ranking list, more of a vehicle just to talk about the relative strength of the different armies and get a bit of discussion going. So if you do think I've ranked your army too high or too low, please let me know down in the comments. All that being said, let's get into it and have a brief chat about the general strength of each army in the meta at the moment, and a few words as to why I think that is. Now I've ranked these into 5 tiers, and we'll start with the lowest one. At the moment, the factions that I think are struggling the most in 40k are Death Guard, Inari and Harlequins. I'd also include the forces of the Inquisition down here, if we are counting them as a full army, but really they're not really playable as an entire faction at the moment, and are only ever going to be a small ally, so I haven't included them on this list officially. Harlequins do have some nasty tricks, in particular those jet bikes can be pretty powerful, particularly if you have to be slogging through tough vehicles with high invul saves that have a low number of wounds. As a faction though, they really are kind of dependent on allying with Craftworlds or Drukhari to have any sort of strength on the battlefield, mainly because their troops just cost quite a lot of points and are fairly fragile despite their snazzy tricks. They're definitely one of the armies that will perform better in the hands of a skilled player, as you do need to play fairly well to keep them alive in the face of usually a heavier firepower. So they are a little bit more of a challenge to play at the moment. They are awaiting a Psychic Awakening update though, so perhaps things might change for them in the future. Next up we also have Inari in this tier, who have really gone from being one of the strongest Eldar factions out there to being fairly underwhelming, mainly because most of their buffs centre around close combat, and they only have a few really strong close combat units that they have access to. You can do some clever shenanigans with the Incarn and Yvraine and things, but typically they just aren't very strong on the tabletop unless they're combining with other Eldar, who basically can do what they do better with the same units and sometimes less restrictions. Again, an update would very much help them, and I do wonder if Games Workshop are ever going to flesh them out as a full faction with their own book at some point. Finally, in the lowest tier I've included the Death Guard. Their codex came out very early in 8th edition, and they were quite strong at the time, with moderate damage output and very decent survivability. Unfortunately, since then they've not really changed, and basically every single army has got a lot stronger around them, to the extent where they really struggle to do much damage to a lot of the armies out there. Mortarion is a beast in close combat, but can be shot down and focused by the entire enemy army for a turn, so isn't exactly going to rescue them. Probably their strongest unit are the Plague Burst Crawlers, which truly are disgustingly resilient, and I'd say they're probably the most competitive unit that Death Guard have at the moment, and you do often see them in mixed chaos lists, but not often with Death Guard as being the only faction. Again, they're due a Psychic Awakening update sometime soon, which I strongly suspect will elevate their status a little. Moving on to Tier 4 now. I feel that these armies are just a little bit stronger on the whole, and have a few more options open to them. Firstly, we have Space Wolves, who I'll admit are not in a great spot right now, but they are due an update in Saga of the Beast very soon, which at the very least will give them combat doctrines, which will be a great help, and I'm sure they'll get some other interesting tricks and shenanigans as well. They did get a lot of decent points drops in chapter approved, so I have a feeling that we'll be seeing a lot of Wolfen and Thunderwolves hitting the table sometime soon. Next we have Tyranids, who are quite an interesting army in that they do have quite a lot of options open to them, but the vast majority of them are just a little bit underpowered at the moment, even despite their Psychic Awakening update. A lot of their units just aren't all that effective point for point, though they do have a few gems, such as Kraken Gene Stealers being hurled forward by the Swarm Lord, Hive Guard shooting out of line of sight, and can get some reasonable board control with a whole load of Fearless Gaunts. I'd certainly say they're reasonably high in this tier, maybe I should have included them in tier 3, but I've just not seen many Tyranid lists that have been very scary or overwhelming compared with the competition recently. I do think a few points drops going their way wouldn't be a bad thing. Next we have Necrons, who did get a fair few decent points drops recently, and they do have some decently strong shooting options in terms of Doomsday Arcs, Doom Scythes, and their squads of destroyers with that stratagem. One of the main weaknesses for Necrons is that they are a little bit inflexible. There aren't really very many successful ways that you can build a good Necron list at the moment. In particular, something to help out their warriors could be very handy, and maybe they'll see that with their update. Next up we have Chaos Demons, who would have been much higher on this list until recently, where in particular things like Massed Space Marine bolter shooting has really hampered their success by making things like Plague Bearers a lot easier to kill. In addition, Plague Bearers were increased in points in chapter approved, and these were one of the main board control and tar pit units that Chaos Demons really relied on. They can certainly make some contributions to a strong Chaos Soup list, though more expensive, those Plague Bearers, particularly with Miasma of Pestilence, can be a real pain to shift for the points, and you can also throw in things like Bloodletter Bombs or fairly cheap Demon Princes to add some punchy threats to a Chaos list. As I keep saying with some of these lower factions, they are due an update, they're likely to get some more interesting rules soon. Next we come to the third tier, which seems to include a decent amount of the armies on this list as a whole. I've included Sisters of Battle in here. They do have some strong options and builds, such as the Valorous Heart ignoring all AP-2 modifiers. They can make a decent cheap bolter gun line with loads of Sisters in power armor, and things like their Seraphim, Zephyrim and Repentia can hit with quite a punch. Some strong builds, and fairly well rounded as a faction, just not quite as many nightmarishly strong options that some of the highest tier armies have. Next up we have Chaos Marines, who have one of their main strengths as having a very big range with a lot of options including many legions, some renegade rules from Vigilus, and loads of new stratagems and options from Faith and Fury. Chaos Space Marines can get hilariously strong if you build the army fairly cleverly and stack a whole load of their buffs together, where they can run around with very silly things like almost unkillable Possessed, Lord Discordants that are -4 to hit, and Obliterators that can shoot twice while being untargetable due to Alpha Legion shenanigans. However, their units don't tend to be the most powerful on their base stats alone, so you do kind of need to seek out these synergies if you want to see them have some success at higher levels. Next up we have Adeptus Mechanicus, who are an army that's had an initially weak codex when they came out, but Games Workshop have basically repeatedly made stronger with chapter approved points drops and the release of their Scorpius Disintegrator hovercraft tanks. They have some interesting options, including being -1 to hit as an entire army, from ranged shooting, Riser Plasma Cataphrons, where if you stack a few buffs on them, they can absolutely murder half an army in one shooting phase, and some very nice punchy close combat units in their Chicken Walkers and the murderous Electro Priests. Again, I do think that they lack some of the raw strength of some of the other factions, and are somewhat dependent on individual units doing big punches with certain stratagems, which is the main reason they're not higher. Again, we'll be seeing some developments for them in Engine War, and I'm very interested to see where they go next. Next up we have the Orcs, who as a faction over a lot of units aren't necessarily the strongest, but they have a really strong core build, with Orc Boys being very dangerous in close combat, and decent ways of getting them there with things like Dead Jump, Endless Green Tide or the Teleporter. They can also have some decent shooting with things like Bad Moon Looters firing twice. The big shock attack gun from the Vigilus detachment can absolutely rinse most armoured targets, and having a whole bunch of cheap scoring Gretchen about is certainly conducive to winning the objective game. Finally, their mech guns are incredibly destructive. 18 smasher guns can take apart quite a lot of your armour very quickly indeed. Interestingly enough, I do think that Orcs are one of the higher skill level armies at the moment, being somewhat dependent on cleverly using the charge phase and using the jump and the stratagems optimally to get your boys where they need to be. Outside from these core units that I mentioned, a lot of their units are pretty overcosted to be honest, and this does restrict their options in how they can be played. I honestly can't wait to see what they get in Saga of the Beast. If they get some genuinely useful stuff that you might field as well as doing these above tricks, the Orcs would certainly be in contention for one of the stronger armies. Despite some of their recent nerfs in Chapter Approved, I have included the Thousand Sons here as well, although I will caveat that with saying that they're significantly less strong when they don't have some allies along. Their psychic powers are very, very powerful, their demon princes are strong and can smite at long range, and they can really kick out a whole ton of mortal wounds between all their characters. They have been hampered a little by the demon princes and Zangors going up in points in Chapter Approved, and they really do benefit from having something like a Plague Bearer screen along in front of them, or some other chaos tricks of one sort or another to back them up. That being said, you can have a mini Thousand Sons army and do very, very well, particularly with some of their interesting tricks that they got in January in Ritual of the Damned. Moving on, we have Chaos Knights, who, much like Thousand Sons, really do need some allies to function as some sort of competitive army, but in terms of raw strength, they certainly do a lot of work. In particular, Knights with the Iconoclast household with 2 thermal cannons are incredibly strong, having great anti-tank at range and very strong stompy melee at close combat. And if you need to add some raw muscle to a Chaos list, then these guys can certainly be an easy way to get that. They really do get a lot stronger though if you can ally in just a few units to take objectives, or perhaps help thin out some hordes, or even just overload the enemy with multiple threats, such as taking something silly like Magnus and Mortarion along as well. Next we come to the Death Watch, who have some very strong core troops choices, and can happily shred just about any infantry target with that special issue ammunition. Some of their units got a fairly recent points drop as well, which only helps them further, but I do think that they've been overshadowed somewhat by Space Marines in the last few months. Now the main Space Marine factions have taken some nerfs, such as the combat doctrines. Perhaps they'll start to shine through as allies, as I do think that their core troops are very strong indeed, but in general I think that they do tend to function better as allies, rather than a standalone force, because they're a bit limited in mobility, and they struggle to find ways to deal with tanks efficiently. Next we have Drukhari, who I do feel have slipped a bit in the rankings as a faction, as they did seem to be one of the strongest armies in 40k at one point. Now they can no longer rely on Eldar Doom and Jinx, and their Ravagers and Razor Wings went up in points cost in the latest Chapter Approved. They are just a little bit more underpowered as a faction than they might otherwise have been. Unfortunately, their Psychic Awakening update was somewhat underwhelming. They gained some interesting options, but not a whole load above what they already had. They still pose a decent threat on the tabletop, particularly with a whole load of disintegrators against marine armies, but at the moment they do tend to suffer against the sheer lethality of the top armies about at the moment. Next we have Genestealer Cult, who I do feel are a strong faction, and when played very well, can absolutely run rings around certain armies, hitting them with devastating hammer blows before returning to the shadows. Unfortunately, in the latest Chapter Approved, their Aberrants went up in points cost and they were one of their core units. The prevalence of Space Marines and their stratagem Auspex scan can really tear a hole in their fragile and killy deep strike units, and they got very mediocre pickings from their Psychic Awakening updates. So though they can be devastating against some opponents, I don't think that they're anywhere near top tier at the moment. Next on the list we have Custodes, and when I place them here I am pretty much assuming that they'll be using some of their Forge World tanks and dreadnoughts along with them, rather than the fairly sparse and limited unit selection that they have in the Games Workshop Codex. They do have some nice tricks within the Codex, including being able to deep strike very close to your opponent, and getting -1 to hit from their Vexilla, but I think they really shine when you're taking along some things like their Caladius Grav tanks or Palace Grav attacks, and even then I think they will tend to typically function best with some other shooty allies as well. So fairly limited in options and the range, but they can have a strong core army if you include these Forge World options. Games Workshop has all but confirmed that they're going to get a new codex very soon as well, and that will certainly be interesting to see. If they do get a new codex in the near future, I will be certainly making some Custodes videos. Next up we come to the Grey Knights with their new revamped rules, in particular their Tides of the Warp, which are a really solid buff for bringing just Grey Knights to the table, in particular the Tide of Shadows making them incredibly hard to kill, or they can switch to a tide that puts out an enormous amount of smite damage, should they be up against an opponent that needs that. Grey Knights are the sort of army where you need to synergize a lot of buffs on a few units, and they have the ideal units in Paladins, and perhaps Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knights as well. I honestly do think that the Grey Knights can potentially be really strong at the moment, but I've not ranked them higher, more because they're just a little bit new at the moment, at least the way that they function competitively now. but they just tend to be a little bit inflexible as well, with only their infantry and characters really being worth taking, their vehicles being somewhat left out in the cold. Still, I'm very happy to see that Games Workshop have drastically boosted one of the weakest factions in the game. Frankly, it's been far too long in coming. Next on the list we have the Dark Angels, who I was a little bit uncertain as to whether or not to put them in here or on the higher tier. They are Space Marines, they have an enormous amount of options, they have combat doctrines, even in their new slightly nerfed form, and they do have a bunch of unique and very punchy units, in particular Talon Masters, Deathwing Knights and Ravenwing Black Knights. I chose to put them lower than some of the other armies, mainly because their unique combat doctrine, the Devastator doctrine, was the one that is most restricted now, only being able to help you out turn 1, and just in general them not having the same raw killing power as some of the other options. That being said, they do have some very interesting unique tricks, and I could certainly have placed them happily in the tier above as well. Now we move on to the second tier, where we're getting into some really strong units and builds. I've included Blood Angels on here, though again they might have been one of the armies that might have been in tier 3 as well. Perhaps I might be slightly biased towards them because I know their rules a little better than Dark Angels, and I'm fairly experienced with the way that they can absolutely tear an army to shreds if you manage to use their very scary, incredibly damaging close combat units to the best of their abilities. Blood of Baal gave them a really strong boost, mainly in that +1 to all of their charge ranges, and that's combined with Shock Assault and some of their points drops in Chapter Approved, really puts their already good damage output absolutely through the roof. They also weren't hit by the Combat Doctrine nerf, as they can still get to Assault Doctrine just as fast as before, although I will say that they often do function better with some shooty allies along as well, so they can function as a punchy attacking force, while something else secures objectives and maybe puts some hurt on enemy ranged elements. Next up we have Astra Militarum, who have generally been incredibly strong throughout 8th edition, although to be honest now I think that some of the other armies are catching them up significantly. They have some of the best infantry in the game, their cheap 4-point guardsmen combined with orders can really punch above their weight and have ludicrous mobility with move. This is backed up with very good long-range fire support, with very efficient tank commanders, and a devastating artillery strike, both of which can be significantly made better with their Vigilus formations, and the new tank ace abilities from Psychic Awakening. I feel that they're somewhat at a bit of a low ebb at the moment, as they just don't match up with Space Marines very well. Very efficient boltifier, chews straight through toughness 3 infantry like nobody's business, and las cannons are pretty much the perfect thing to take out the tanks and artillery at the back. So I think their ability is a little bit suppressed at the moment, which is why we're not seeing them topping tournaments quite as much. But it wouldn't take very much in terms of changing the status quo for them to really punch through and become a bit more dominant again. Next we have Imperial Knights, who were pretty much some of the strongest things around until the Space Marines rose to power with the dawn of their new codex. Similarly to Guard, I think that we'd see a lot more of them if Marines weren't about quite so much, as Space Marine firepower and close combat is pretty good at dealing with armoured targets like the Knights. In particular, the Knight Crusaders are incredibly versatile shooting platforms that can also give the enemy a good kicking in close combat as well, and it's hard to argue with a trio of Tyrannus or Crass Crusaders, making a very scary core firepower and durability unit for the army. As with the Chaos Knights, they're just so much stronger when you do have some allies along, either Astra Militarum for those very cheap troops, or perhaps Adeptus Mechanicus to put some wounds back on the Knights, and perhaps even give them canticles with Knight of the Cog. Next on the list is the Tau Empire, who have generally had the ability to throw some ludicrous firepower downrange, and that's very much the case at the moment. Riptides are durable, efficient firepower units, and boosted with Cao Yun and a bit of Marker Light support, they really can punch through the armour of a lot of armies. Those armies will then very much struggle to punch back, because all the Riptides are typically safe behind a whole swarm of shield drones, who are absolutely obnoxious to kill for the points, and means that if you ever shoot the Riptides with any heavy weapons, then they can just take it on shield drones and laugh off the damage. On top of this, Hammerheads and Skyrays remain decently strong. Their Crisis suits obtain some really nice buffs in Psychic Awakening, particularly in the Farsight Enclave variants. A couple of the new Sept tenets really make the broadside smart missiles and high yield missile pods a lot stronger than before, and they were already ridiculously efficient, and you can now give one of the Riptides an enormously powerful ion accelerator that does an average of 5 damage every time it scores a successful wound. These guys can be an incredibly tricky army to beat when they are played by a skilled player. Next up we have Combined Chaos, who I know aren't technically a single faction, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that Chaos gets a lot out of being allied to each other, as unlike a lot of the Imperial units, they can share buffs and synergies between the various different factions of chaos, mainly through the overlapping buffs conveyed by their god-specific keyword, such as Nurgle or Khorne or Tzeentch for example. Several of their factions provide one or two very powerful tricks, and when you combine them all together, you really can get some very silly things with synergy going. They can give some of the strongest things out there a pause, particularly when you're stacking things like untargetable units and massive negative modifiers to hit. Finally for tier 2, I think the craft worlds are also up here as well, and can be played in a couple of flavours, either a Laytok with stacking multiple -1 to hit modifiers. In particular, their flyer spam is still very hard for a lot of armies to counter, as they just can't hit the things and do enough damage before the flyers hoover them off the board. In more recent times though, we seem to be seeing some slightly more ground-based Eldar using a lot of tanks and jet bikes to achieve their goals. Some of their options from Psychic Awakening genuinely seem to be seeing more play than the Laytok these days. In particular, things like Expert Crafters, which is their version of Master Artisans, to reroll 1 hit and wound roll per unit, which just gives a massive flat damage buff to the entire army. You can combine that with other things such as ignoring cover on their shooting, and they also gained a whole load of interesting Exarch powers, which can make units like Shining Spears a lot more of a handful to deal with on the table. In particular, some of their units are very good at taking out Space Marines, such as those Shining Spears, who can also get across the board in the blink of an eye. And they can also spam loads of Star Cannons and Bright Lances, which are great at punching through Space Marine style armour. So all this begs the question, what's in tier 1? Though it's not really that much of a question, because we've been talking about them throughout the whole video. Yes, even after the FAQ that nerfed combat doctrines and duty eternal, I still think that Space Marines are very much the army to beat at the moment. I will admit that they aren't quite as oppressive as before. Now the combat doctrines have been nerfed, which basically is a big blow to Iron Hands not being able to stay in their very, very powerful combat doctrine all game long and spam some very murderous heavy weapons. While this has helped tone them down a bit, I still think that Space Marines are going to be strong going forward. They have some units that are incredibly strong for how much they cost, such as Eliminators, the Invictor, and Assault Centurions, to name but a few. And they have the widest array of options between their 7 supplement books, as well as all the stratagems that they get in the main codex. At the moment, I think that the single strongest things in Space Marine lists are the Iron Hands infantry list, with Iron Father Phyros and the Chief Apothecary, where they get a 5+ invul save and 5+ feel no pain, which means that you can almost never be efficient in killing intercessors when they're backed up in this way. Another really powerful build is the Raven Guard Assault Centurion bombs. Admittedly, they can't throw them up at the front of the board turn 1, they have to do that with aggressors, which is still amazing. But those Assault Centurions can still be coming out of reserve in Tactical Doctrine, throwing over 70 bolter shots and an average of 50 flamer hits at you, before charging and pretty much auto-killing whatever they make contact with. Even if these 2 most powerful builds do get dealt with in, say, the Spring Balance update, I still think that the Space Marines will be okay, though it will most certainly narrow the gap between them and the rest of the other armies, and it might promote a little bit more diversity. Maybe we'll be seeing more Ultramarines, Salamanders, and White Scars lists played more. It would be good to see a few more versatile options on the table. So I hope that helped as a general overview of some of the strongest armies in the meta at the moment. I know I've not talked about literally every strong option here, but that would involve talking about most of the game of Warhammer 40k, and we need to draw the line somewhere. If you think that I've either overvalued or undervalued certain armies, please let me know why down in the comments. I'll be honest, with these tier systems, I was certainly having a lot of debates with myself whether or not one army should be 1 tier higher or 1 tier lower. In any case, I'm glad that Games Workshop has been doing something to rein Space Marines in a bit, as I do think that 8th edition is one of the most varied formats of 40k we've ever seen, with at least the chance of most armies being able to compete right at the highest tier of the game, provided they continue to rein in the most powerful things at each balance update. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I try and have some 40k content coming out every day, so check back if you'd like to see more. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to spend so much time making these videos. So if you are enjoying them regularly, any support that you could leave on the Patreon would be massively appreciated. There's also certain other benefits for signing up for a small amount a month, such as voting on future videos for the channel, seeing early videos, and the occasional prize draw. So have a look at the link below if that interests you at all. In any case, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.